we're going to begin this morning with the opportunity to discuss the wonderful, wonderful presentation that David Hurst Thomas gave us last night.
David, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the intersection, we were talking about at breakfast, intersection of archaeology and history, the intersections of how those come together, or do they come together? Or maybe they need to come together more, or what?
Well, that's a good question. I enjoyed what we were talking about this morning. There's several things that can be said about that. One, as an apology for being an archaeologist consuming the first night of the archive, is the notion about trying to broaden this notion of what an archive really is. And I took on what I do as an archival exercise, and it involves documents, and it involves reading them, and very often it involves multiple interpretations of what the original meant. And there is a translation aspect to it, because just like when you're reading epigraphy, that has to be translated into Old Spanish, which has to be translated into New Spanish. So I see a lot of parallels that might be useful on the archival side, the archaeological side, and the historical side. Now, we could explore that at a number of levels. Traditional documental archives and archaeological archives contain stuff, but the requirements of keeping those things for posterity, or at least a very long time, are really different. What's happened in our museum collections is increasingly make them more inaccessible. And I see that a little bit on the document archive side too. We've got a rare book room at the American Museum of Natural History that has some wonderful things. But our librarian seems to think the idea is to get all those treasures in one place and lock them up and keep people out of them. Now, the digital era is going to change that. We have a parallel in archaeology where we get the artifacts, and I mentioned last night that we gave everything away from the Franciscan site to the Fernbank Museum of Natural History in Atlanta. So that meant that all the research that we're doing, and we're still doing a lot of research on that material, we have to go to Atlanta, and my students, and borrow back what we still consider are our collections, except they're their collections. And what we're able to do now with 3D imaging is so remarkable. There was a piece in last week's paper about the Queen Nefertiti, and the imaging was so good on that they considered it theft. So not only are there issues about in Germany, should they give back the Egyptians the original sculpture, but the 3D images are even coming under proprietary concerns. The upside of it is, what we're able to do, we can't lend artifacts to schools. We can't do it. But what we can do now is, and this just happened with the Channel Islands in California, we have one of the famous artifacts from there. There are 3 others that are somewhere in California. So what they've done is all of us have 3D imaged those, and we supply the images to all the schools who are interested. And all they have to do is hook it up to a 3D printer, and they've got it. So there's a great deal that's coming along here. And I think there are pretty good parallels between a traditional document-based archive and the other applications that we have. Now, you asked me a little bit about history as well. And in my field, when I was coming out of school, I was told that I had to choose what kind of archaeologist I wanted to be. If I wanted to be a, quote, prehistoric archaeologist, then I'd need to take a lot of geology and do a lot of field work so that I could understand how stone tools are made, how pottery is made, all that. But if I wanted to become a historical archaeologist or a historic sites archaeologist, I was encouraged at the first year in graduate school, you have to take an entirely different curriculum. You have to learn languages, you have to understand documents, and then you'll be working mostly with architecture. So you need to take a lot of courses like that. Fortunately, that's back in the Miocene when I went to school. Now, one of the I write textbooks, introductory archaeology textbooks, and one of the things that we promote is there are two kinds of archaeologists for sure, good and bad. But that split that we had between people who work on, say, what used to be called Anasazi archaeology, here, Ancestral Pueblo, and people who would say work on Spanish missions, today those are the same people. And I work on materials that are 12,000 years old, 1,200 years old, and 400 years old. And what we've recognized is the important thing for archaeologists is to learn what we do well. And we should learn to find things well, we should learn to excavate them, we need to conserve them, we can interpret them, and learn what we don't do well. And what we don't do well is mess around in other people's archives. And so what goes with this is there's no more approach in my field about one scholar sort of gets a field and controls it. Now everything we do is interdisciplinary. That's why Father Conrad fit in so well with our program. We routinely have geologists and zoologists and specialists in human remains, if that's what it is. So we're accustomed, I meant that seriously about archaeology being a team sport. So what, in a way, it's odd because it cuts both ways. It means that I can legitimately work on sites over a huge range and ask questions that go from the very first American to the very first European and beyond. So it opens up a great range, but what I can actually do, hands-on, with my own expertise, we're so specialized now that you've really got to be able to work with other people and listen to them. And I would suspect there are parallels in the history field as well.
Jeff?
Jess?
I was fascinated by your discussion about the broken bells, and you suggested that in one case the broken bells had been placed on the altar, and the other broken bell was kind of in the sacred place. And I think you were implying that there was a pro-Christian faction that you were. How did you come to that conclusion just from the presence of these bells?
We didn't do it just from the presence of the bells, but as we go back and James Brooks and several others who were working on the archaeology of not just the Pueblo Revolt, but also what happened at Guadalupe. As we understand more about the structure of ancient Pueblo society in the Southwest, we understand that factionalism is so critical to the story that it's rare. See, one of the real problems when Coronado came through here in 1540 was he couldn't find anybody to talk to, because there's not an individual leader in Pueblo society. So someone will sign a treaty or make an agreement, but ramified so, it's cut through so many different ways that nobody's actually in charge. And you can make a case based on the new work that's been done at Chaco Canyon with the influence from Mexico, that what they did was reject hierarchy when they moved out of Chaco Canyon. So when they came up into this area, they were egalitarian for sure, and they reinforced it. So this is a very frustrating thing from the outside to try to crack that, and the Franciscans were very frustrated by this. This is in extreme contrast to what happened in the Southeast. When De Soto comes through, he's meeting Mississippian leaders. There is clearly one person in charge. There is they run into a litter, De Soto does. A woman is being carried with 1,000 ermines on her and 10,000 pearls. And he says, she might be in charge. And so the idea is you can take the leader at the top of each hierarchy and make a deal, and then everybody else is expected to fall in line. Well, that's not the case here. So when I was talking about that, if we actually go back and reread the documents with the factionalism in mind, rather than the dominance paradigm, you can see several things. One of the things that comes out is, particularly during the early Franciscan period here, the Catharines cult is dominant. It's very popular, and what they're doing is recruiting certain young males as part of the priesthood to work into Kachina rituals. That means a number of not quite as high-ranking males are being excluded from that training. And what they're finding is one of the early appeals of the church was giving those young guys a chance. And so there was quite...
It's right here and right there.
Okay. So it looks like there's, if you look at the baptism records that are available here, there's a heavy recruitment toward young males of a certain lower social status, and Christianity is very appealing to them. Now what's the Kachina cult do for women? Nothing. They're invited to butt out. So the appeal of a religion that holds a virgin as a symbol is extraordinary. We were talking a little bit about the rock art. Sometimes the rock art shows up from the early church here. So what I'm saying is there are a number of examples, if you look for them, that show the factionalism, extreme factionalism, that's characteristic of Pueblo societies. And the friars were very quick to pick up on this. And so as you can trace the evolution, when I was talking about the convent of Kivas, that was only was only permitted for about 30 or 40 years. Then there was a crackdown by the state on Kachinas and on the Kivas, and that's when the trouble began that led up to 1680. So that's what I was getting at.
I was sharing a story about the bells with David just a few minutes ago, and that is that the bells are still very important in New Mexico, including the baptizing of bells and the bells having godparents. About 25 years ago at Peña Blanca, the young friar pastor they've been doing some church restoration, and they put the two bells back in the tower. And so when the two bells were put back in the tower and being rededicated, they had padrinos, they had godparents for a married couple for each one of the two bells. And they had a ceremony to baptize the bells. And so they literally had the godparents pulling the ropes down on the ground, and to baptize the bells very creatively, that young,
Amiable
anarchist friar had taken had a whole great trough of water balloons. He blessed the water balloons, the water in the water balloons, and all of the kids in the village threw the water balloons up at the bells to baptize the bells. And so it was just that tradition. That was 25 years ago here in New Mexico.
Yes?
I was impressed by your idea that archaeology is interdisciplinary, as a team effort. Talk about coincidence, and there is no coincidence. When I lived in Denver, I made friends with an architect up there who actually was part of a team in Chaco Canyon. And one of his things that he was analyzing was a kiva. And he discovered in the process of his architectural analysis that this kiva was impermeable to water on the inside of the kiva, not on the outside. And his curiosity, why, he began to look, and he found trails that actually channeled water into the kiva. So it may have been, at least for this particular settlement in Chaco Canyon, very ancient, may have been a cistern before it became a kiva.
It's fun to do modern architectural studies. We were just speaking about that, about the churches as well, to bring modern technology and take a look at that. Pueblo Bonito is a classic example of that. If you look at the solar gain, the way that's constructed to capture solar energy coming in, or I work a lot in caves out in the Great Basin, in the mountains, and we can see that it's only the south-facing shelters that are used, because the sun will hit the back of these shallow rock shelters and heat it during the winter, and then when the sun is in a different place in the winter, that heat sink affects for about 3 months. It's easy to go overboard on these, and part of being a good scientist is we have the right to be wrong. And so you have to build in, how do you test that, rather than just have that be a cool idea? Yes?
I want to go back to the Santa Catalina Island discoveries. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join the members of the Academy to that trip, but I heard a lot about it. And I was fascinated by the overview of the convento part. And my question was, in those missions in that area, what do you estimate would have been the number of friars who had cells within the convento?
We have very poor records, say compared with California mission records in the southeast. And to some extent that's true in the southwest. Here, many of them were destroyed in the Pueblo Revolt. We just have a problem with the Spanish pulling out twice out of Florida. So we're pretty poor on the record side, except for what you're asking, because the Franciscan order kept their records elsewhere. And so many of those records have survived. So we know the names of every friar who served in the Spanish missions that I was talking about. So we know exactly who was stationed at Santa Catalina at any one point in time. So during the rebellion, there were two, Brother Michael and Brother Antonio. They were probably the ones living in the first convento that we were looking at there. And then there would be visitations where others would come through, and we have some records from that. But the population of friars is usually just one per mission. And then the neophytes are brought in, and there is, because it's a very heavily stratified society, it's probably the Miko, or the cacica, the woman in charge, who assigned certain probably high-ranking relatives to serve with the friars. They probably lived in the convento as well. So in terms of ordained personnel, there's one, maybe two at any time. The military is a very minor presence here until, well, this is St. Augustine of 1565. The earliest British settlement, Roanoke, is 1585, and that's unsuccessful, and Jamestown is 1607. So as the slave-owning, rum-peddling British start moving down, and they're converting Indians on their own terms, they get to Charleston in 1670. And so that's it. St. Catharines is the northernmost of the Hispanic Franciscan tier. Charleston is the southernmost. And so the potential is there. When they bring soldiers in, they're not allowed to be part of the mission compound itself. And we don't have an actual record of the siege of Santa Catalina in 1680. What they did was transplant the church to the next island south. So you have a Santa Catalina de Wally on St. Catharines. You have a Santa Catalina de Wally a year later on the next island down. And we do have records from there. And what the scuttlebutt, of course, is all the mistakes they made on St. Catharines. And what the soldiers are saying is the reason we lost St. Catharines Island is because you would not allow us to wear our swords at Mass. And this is a Captain Fuentes who pushed the point to where ultimately he was excommunicated. So we're very iffy on a lot of elements of what went on there, but we do know which friars served where. Yes?
I had a question on the medallions with the 4 knots.
So do I.
Was there any evidence of habits in the area that were indigo color that would show
That's,
in the traditional brown?
that's a good question, and the answer is no. That we do actually have through a weird, southeastern climates are not friendly to archaeology. But in part of the church, we have an unusual dynamic where part of an infant is buried in a shroud cloth that it has preserved because there's gold and silver in touch with it. We have no records that I'm aware of that let us assign colors at all to the habits that are there. And that's one of my real open questions. That's something I truly don't understand. Yes?
Did I understand you correctly that there were no friars buried there?
You did. When I talked to Bishop Lassard about is it appropriate, is it okay if we excavate these remains, this could be one of the most important cemeteries ever excavated in this country. And I told you, he said it's fine, the souls have departed. But his question was, let me know if you find a friar. And I thought I knew the answer to that question, but I asked it anyway. How could I tell? And he says, oh, it's easy. The neophytes are all going to be buried with their feet toward the altar and their hands crossed on their chest. They're supposed to be buried like paupers, but they were not. But a friar, on the other hand, would be buried near the altar the other direction. And I asked Bishop Lassard, why would that be? And he says, oh, it's easy, because on Resurrection Day they will all rise up and he will lead them into heaven. So we had that in mind. We could also biologically tell very clearly who Native American from a European. There are no Europeans there, and in fact we understand now there are probably no friars buried in any of the missions in Spanish Florida. It looks like the remains were all taken to the convento in St. Augustine, which is now a National Guard base.
So you're not able to tell if there's any...
Actually, in the case of St. Catharines, and Father Conrad was involved in this, I think we found those graves. And it's very, this is one of those no coincidence stories. We were excavating, my wife and I were working on it, and Conrad comes over from his part of the site and says, what are you digging? And I said, I'm digging a pit that's about this big and this wide. And he says, it looks like it was dug a couple of times. He said, yeah, you can tell that. And he said, but why is it so small? And I said, well, if it's a grave pit, it looks like whoever was buried here in these two pits were butchered first and put in. And he says, then why was it dug twice? Well, it looks like the remains were initially put in and then removed and taken elsewhere. And they missed some of the small pieces. This happened at Little Bighorn. When they went back to the Custer battlefield, those graves were excavated 2 different times, and you'd see the teeth and the finger bones and things are missed. And that's what we were seeing in here. And Father Conrad says, tell me how that differs from the treatment of Brother Michael and Brother Antonio. And I said, I don't think it differs at all. And he said, do you think it's a coincidence that nobody could find this in 300 years? And I said, well, we had good technology and this and that. And he said, don't you think it was being saved? And I'm getting a little skeptical about where this conversation's going, you know. And he says, dig very carefully, because those could be relics, and they could save thousands of lives. And so that's got me a little nervous. And he says, but go ahead, you're supposed to be doing this. And I kind of joked with him and said, do you mean that my trial is being guided by God? He just gave me the no coincidence line. And I said, we use a lot of geophysics. And I said, well, the scientist in me then just says this has to be the ultimate remote sensing. And we'll deal with that. Yes?
I was just going to make a comment and also ask you a question. I live right across the valley from Guadalupe, and I'm Navajo, and as a Navajo young person growing up in that area, I never really knew the history of it. But my friend Brother Paul was explaining to me last night. But we were told, you know, that's taboo. We stay away from there. It's a very sacred place. And my husband had the nerve to ask me last night, have you ever been there? And I said, no way. I've never been there. But that's a very sacred place in terms of, because of the people, I guess, that were.
Well, Watanabe is an extraordinarily difficult place for Hopi people, too.
Yes. So my question to you is, what's your thoughts about why were the Kiowas in the church areas?
There at Hopi, at Watanabe, or in general.
You mentioned that they found Kivas in
Right,
some of the churches.
right.
So what's your interpretation of that? Why do you believe
Well, I think the conventional wisdom, as I talked about very briefly, the doctrine of superposition, is that you have a superior force creating an architecture that reflects its dominance over an inferior force. And there are cases when this clearly happens in places. You can see it in the Valley of Mexico, where the primary temple is built on Temple Mayor, and there are many cases where this did occur. I have yet to see any case established other than just the belief of the historians that it happened in the American Southwest. But the kiva is taken as one of the primary examples of this. We have a more powerful religion than you do, and we're going to show that dominance by placing the most important part of our church, the altar, on your most sacred place. And this was the interpretation that Harvard published, and it's been really carried on since the 1940s. If you look at the stratigraphy, and you won't be able to see it in this very well, but there are 3 altars built on top of that with a wooden roof. And modern Hopi, there's quite an oral history project at Hopi right now, working with the University of Arizona. And what they're doing in Oahtave is really a sensitive topic. And what they're doing, and they're working with archaeologists, it looks like, based on the documents that archaeologists accumulated when they excavated it, that kiva was very carefully filled and preserved in a way that the Hopi, at least some of the modern Hopi, think that that is a deliberate fusion of what was there and taking care of it with placing the altar on top of it. Now you can argue with that interpretation, but even the question hadn't come up until the last couple of decades. Now the other ones that I was showing you are where they're building a kiva inside a convento. The one at Abo, at the Salinas missions, is clearly constructed under the supervision of friars. There's no question about it. Why would they do that? Well, it looks like they would do it because it's the prime instructional space for youth. And if you can bring people in to teach where they're comfortable and use some of their customs, that apparently happened a great deal, and the governor of New Mexico approved of that, until he didn't. In the 1650s, there was a crackdown on a number of things. The Kachina called one, and the convento kiva idea, secondly, and there are people who believe that that is one of the causal factors of the Pueblo Revolt, because of this crackdown. Now the other example, the one at Pecos, is the kiva was found 25 years ago in the convento, and it was just assumed that has to be the reverse superposition that I talked about. But by doing the archaeology here, in this case, it's really understanding the adobes that were used to build it, clearly place it in the 1630s, 40s, meaning, again, under the supervision of a friar.
David, isn't this fusion, I mean, isn't that really the whole strategy of Spanish Catholicism in Mexico and the Americas? In other words, the incorporation of certain elements, even religious elements, of the indigenous people into Spanish Catholicism. And the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is often held as the prime example of that. But so finding this fusion here is not necessarily out of sync with the religious conversion strategies of the Spanish, or am I?
Well, what you say is true. There is that dominance model that I talked about. Then there's a school of thought that's been around for a long time called syncretism. And that's the drawing together of elements, and it's a form of acculturation to where the indigenous society ends up being almost a watered down version of the other group that came in, and they're emphasizing elements in common. I think that's the way it's being looked at now, and I didn't talk about indigenous archaeology last night, but there's quite a movement of tribal members doing their own archaeology and asking their own questions. I showed those 3 books last night, Columbian Consequences. The proceeds from those started the Native American Scholarship Fund for the Society of American Archaeology. And what we did was, and do, is provide funding for interested Native Americans and now Hispanic students as well to go and train, to go to a field school, to go on my dig, to learn about the techniques of archaeology. And what's coming out of that and several other lines of inquiry today are moving away from the syncretism and looking more at the dynamics of each of the communities involved. And that's why I was stressing the factionalism that you're seeing, that the friars were well aware See, if you look at what happened here in the Southwest, it's very different than what happened in California. When Father Sarah came in, what he was doing is he needed to be on his home ground. So he would go near a large native village, set up a bell, ring the bell, and say, "Heathens, come here and join me." And he was acting in complete faith because of Maria de Agreda, that they had already been preached to, and they would recognize friars and come down and join him. So that's called a reduction strategy, where they're coming to him. That isn't possible in the Southwest with the established communities. So what the friars were forced to do is to move into the communities and become part of the politics. And it was known at the time that you are going to come in and you're going to have to choose up sides, and you're going to have to make decisions, and part of this community is not going to like you. So I think the efforts, if we look at Kivas and several other things that are going on, they're trying to, my guess is, and we're just starting to ask these questions, but how do you navigate that terrain? If your concern is really to save souls, then how is that best played out in Pueblo society that's egalitarian and is divided into moieties? There are two parts to that. How do you play to that audience and still be true to why you're there? I think it's a really complicated dynamic, but we're starting to learn a lot more about it. Yeah.
I see similarities between what was happening in the Southwest, not with California, but with central Mexico in the 16th century in the Franciscan use of language in evangelizing, in which they tried to find similar concepts to try to explain what Christianity was about. It had its own issues because we have different worldviews and different meanings, and then we're ethnologists. But not so much the syncretism, but rather trying to find an avenue in which to communicate and reach a population. And so I find more similarity there than I do in California, where the work the Franciscans did was based on a different model of how to go about it. I mean, very early on, Franciscans in the 16th century didn't want to incorporate indigenous populations into the Spanish society. So, it's interesting to see the use of the kiva and the use of language, indigenous languages in the 16th century.
I think your emphasis on differing strategies is exactly right. I didn't go into this last night, but when I started working, I began in California and went to the Southeast, worked in Georgia, Florida, then came here to the Southwest. My interest was on the native side. The Indians couldn't be more different between California, the Southwest, and the Southeast. And so my research strategy was, if we can hold Franciscan thought constant, then the differences in the missions will be played out, reflecting the Aboriginal differences. And it took me a long time to understand, and I had some helpers in this room. You cannot hold the Franciscan strategy constant. And as we look more closely, it's even in those areas. It can be quite different at one mission from another mission. How we learn that is difficult. One thing, 2 years ago when we had the board meeting on St. Catharines, most of us attended a conference in St. Augustine that was talking about this. And Tim Johnson, who organized that, dropped a blockbuster on everybody there. He's working on literacy in the southeastern missions. And there's something like 70% literate, and thousands of people, and they're actually, the earliest book is a Confessionario, 1613, from Father Perea. They're apparently communicating in a written form in their indigenous languages that they're being taught by the friars who were there. So they're fluent in Spanish, but they're also retaining their local languages. And when he gave this presentation, I was floored. And if you look at the level of literacy, as you just pointed out, both here in the Southwest is extremely low, and Father Sarah in the California missions wouldn't have it because there was so much competition with the state. The last thing he wanted were people not going through him and the missions and conducting their own politics. So totally different strategies.
Just to point out, and I might mention, or we might mention, but Berard Hiley, who was one of the friars who came here in 1902, when he came, he started to work on the Navajo language. And he is the first one to write the Navajo language and to then prepare catechisms, to all this material. And in that building, right over there, are his work is in the reading room there. We have the first written form of the Navajo language.
That's terrific.
Franciscans who say basically who create this classical Nahuatl, written language, and it's the Franciscans who do that in New Spain, in the 16th century.
Yes.
Before going to the Franciscan mission of Laguna Pueblo, I had heard ideas about syncretism and kind of melding things together, but what was an eye-opener for me was arriving in Laguna Pueblo. One of the men who was, on the one hand, a native leader in religious activities, on the other hand, he's a sacristan of one of the Catholic churches there. He took me into the main church at Laguna and showed me the altar screen, and it had 4 pillars, red and green spirals. And he said, "Father, those 2 colors symbolize the Catholic way and the native way. They're distinct, but they're mutually supporting. They're not melding, but they do see some similarities between the two. And being both Catholic and native, they're the stronger person for it."
Right.
So,
And I that's a wonderful story. And the elements of that shows that both of those are retaining their own strength. It's not a watering down in between. It's considered, like the old story about how you can break an arrow, but if you have 5 arrows, you can't break it.
and they're very strong in their belief and their Catholic way.
Yes.
But just to add to that, we know, but by studying different ethnic groups and so forth, whether immigrants and so forth, nothing remains constant. Culture cannot remain constant. There's always a change. So even here, there's got to be changes. And part of that is syncretism, part of it is fusion. You cannot remain cultures that are going to be distinct, especially after a conquest.
Well, then that's true. And what's coming out is the change on both sides. Everybody recognizes the changes in Native American society as a result of the contact here. But I think looking at changing Franciscan strategies and tactics, holding what is the constant that will not be allowed to change, and what is appropriate to change in certain contexts is something I really didn't give that much thought to until I started talking to a number of Franciscans and understanding more of that.
What's so important about this is that we're living through this right now. This is part of what's being played out in today's politics, the sense of too much change, demographic, cultural, and so forth, and which scares certain people. We see that in the political discourse. And so in a way, what we're talking about is applicable to us right now because of these kinds of forces of change and fear of change, and what is the nature of that change? Is it a threat? Is it something to be welcomed, and so forth and so on?
Well, and if you want to translate that to the Middle East, look what's happening to archaeological sites of another culture or archaeological museums of another culture. That power of the past and other religions is so powerful that those have to be destroyed. And that's not the first time that's happened, but it's probably the first time we've seen it on CNN. Yes?
David, one of the things that I know a little bit about in my study of Franciscan history is that the Franciscan missions of what we call the U.S. Southeast right now were part of a bigger phenomenon of the Franciscan mission in the Caribbean, Santo Domingo, Cuba, Florida. Do you know of any work that maybe you're doing or other people are doing to make the sites that are contemporaneous across the Caribbean in Franciscan missions talk to each other?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the answer is no. When we undertook the Colombian Consequences series that Father Conrad was involved with, we tried to marshal every bit of mission archaeology I could find in the New World. And there's some work done in the Maya area, there was a little bit in Guatemala, but at the time, there's almost nothing. And what was happening, our dig in the southeast was the first real one to begin that. I mentioned how little was done here. California was held way back because there was a perception, like I said last night, you can walk up and put your hand on that history, you can talk to a Franciscan, you can talk to a native Californian who needs to dig archaeology. That has changed dramatically in the last quarter century. We know more now about the missions of the southeastern United States than from any other area, because there's been such a concerted effort with Bonnie McEwen and several other people involved. So there's a great deal going on in the southeast, but we haven't yet been able to make that connection with the larger Caribbean that you're talking about. And that's mostly because we're not asking the questions. But I would suspect that the same kind of processes with the archaeological questioning, we can learn from mission sites. We can learn in Cuba, we can learn in the DR and the others. I'm not aware of anything, but I would certainly think that would be a rich field for somebody to go into. I think the potential is there.
I'll go back to the pieces of cracked bell.
Yeah.
Again, I was curious about what that signified. Was it kind of a one-off activity in the moment of, say, impending disaster, so that it's a symbolism of imploring protection at that moment by posing the pieces on the altar? Or had the broken bell become sort of like a replacement symbol that you would, for example, pose a crucifix on the altar for daily mass?
That's a really hard question to answer, because we've just really only begun this research. I'm working through, part of it requires that we do the biography of these bells in great detail. And that requires a lot of geochemistry, and we're working on that now. But there's also a forensic part. I showed just one slide of it, but each of these bell fragments is now being studied. How exactly, why did it break? It's not easy to break a bell, unless you don't want to, and then they break all the time. But trying to understand those life histories, I think there are multiple stories here. My reading of the two examples I gave you is a pro-Franciscan faction that survived the Pueblo revolt, and they're carrying on their religion before the Reconquest. Now, we'd have to see a lot more archaeology to prove that, but there's a good bit of indigenous archaeology going on at Jemez right now about exactly what happened between 1680 and 1692 when they were free on their own. And I think some communities, the factionalism, see, if you read the detailed history of the Pueblo revolt, it wasn't at all a universal thing at first. In fact, when Popé came down from Taos, he literally murdered his own brother because his brother was in the pro-Franciscan side. And there's San Marcos was going to go on the side of the friars, and then they were powered into going along with the rebellion. In the Galisteo, there's 3 or 4 murders that can be traced there. So these communities get flattened out in the archives. And if we can do the archaeology of these sites and try to track that down, I think we can probably come up with better questions. I think that bell, the big piece I showed you last night, I bet we're going to find that came from Pecos. It's not even a San Cristobal bell to begin with. There's enough hint in the ethnography that Pecos went back and forth a little bit too, but then became one of the leaders in the rebellion. They had to strong-arm the Galisteo missions to do that, and there is an account that Bandelier records in the 1890s in his work at Pecos of stealing the bell out of Pecos and trying to get it safely to across into the Galisteo Basin, and it broke. And there are pieces that are apparently even still around today that may come from that bell. But until we can fingerprint them, and tell exactly the life histories of those bells. Then we're just kind of making it up like I'm doing. Yes?
Going back a little bit, all right, we have two deacons at Tohatchee, and in presenting the dogma and so forth, right, Catholic, right, we would say, they would go the same way we would say things, but they would put in a phrase or a sentence, more often a sentence, that we would not think of putting in, and all of a sudden, the people's faces would light up, and they understood. So the connections aren't always being made.
I think that's right. That makes sense to me. What my first reaction is, because as an archaeologist, we deal with materiality. How would that translate into something that we can see? And I think we're beginning to see the hints of that by looking at the bells and by looking at some of the artifacts associated with the missions. How you've got a paper in your new book, Jeff, by Elliot Blair, that you've met, who's a new professor, one of my students now at the University of Alabama. But what he's doing is looking at the 70,000 glass trade beads that we got at Mission Santa Catalina, which is a huge collection. And he's able to work through the glass chemistry now to track how do those, you do the life history of 70,000 glass bells. They're from all over the world. But they come in through a trade network and they go into the hands of the Indian leader, it looks like, who distributes them out to different communities depending on how well they're following the Franciscan doctrine. And we think we're starting to be able to see that in bells.
And sometimes this have happened 2, 3, 4 times in regard to the same matter.
Well, I think it's those fine-grained dynamics that are going to get us somewhere, but we're not going to really, it's hard to do archaeology at that level, and it's also hard to do archival studies. We talked about the importance of oral history and how change is recorded there, and exactly how you read the documents and which documents are even made available from 1680. We got it all covered. Yes?
How has this journey with your career affected your faith?
Now that's a good question. That's a very good question. I was raised Presbyterian, and I came to a crossroads when I came I was going into graduate school, or making a decision. I was pre-med, and I'd had some pretty serious encounters with orthopedic surgeons as a kid, and I thought that's really what I wanted to be. And so I was all set to go to medical school, but pre-med's not a major. So I was also fascinated with Indians, and I found I could major in anthropology, and to major in anthropology you have to go in a dig class, and I found I really like this stuff. I like discovering things and being the first person to see it in 5,000 years. So I had to make a decision. My folks never forgave me for not becoming a real doctor. But in the process of doing that, it created a real crisis in faith, because almost nobody who goes into anthropology was a practicing church member. Margaret Mead didn't go to church. She believed strongly in the church as an institution, but she didn't do it. And my folks saw this as a real flaw in becoming an academic. I went through this 3 years talking to different people about how, my professors, how do you handle this? And at the time, the strategy was you turn your back on it. Because if you're going to be an objective scientist, you can't have those kind of subjective beliefs carrying over your career. I don't think that's true anymore. We have exhibits now in my museum. We get 5 million people a year coming in, and we have an exhibit on evolution. And it's going through, it's showing all the fossils and working through, but there's one part of that which is a series of videos by different scientists who are talking about the importance of evolution. Without evolution, biology is just stamp collecting. The rest of it, you have to have a general theory that makes it have sense, but you also have to have your personal beliefs. And each one of the speakers is making a case, I can be a card-carrying scientist and still have my personal belief systems that does not interfere in my science. That's a pretty new way of approaching it. And the interactions I've had, particularly with the Franciscan order, make me wonder if maybe I took the wrong road there. I don't know. A little long in the tooth to make any changes, I suspect. But your question is right on the money. And it's one my graduate students ask. Today, we've had St. Catharines Project that I talked a lot about. We've been at it for 40 years. We have interns who come, and of our interns and then employees, we've had 50 PhDs and MAs complete the program on St. Catharines Island archaeology. And I bet of those 50 over 4 decades, I would say half of them now are very strongly religious. And that's a real change in our field. I didn't quite answer your question. Yes.
I have a Borderlands question. You actually started your talk last night talking about the Borderlands, Spanish Borderlands and so forth. And that, of course, has become a huge field, Borderlands history, and of course, people in cultural studies have kind of taken. So the concept of border has become a metaphor for almost anything you want. But it seems to me, archaeologists have been somewhat kept out of that dialogue, I think. Do you have a perspective on these new Borderlands studies?
Yeah, I do. And you raise a good point. I mentioned Herbert Bolton last night. And I'm proud of my 50 students who got their MAs and PhDs. He had 136 get PhDs and MAs in his Borderlands studies. And he started with a very effective point, that American history is written through Anglo-colored glasses. And anything Hispanic and by extension Catholic is denigrated in American history. And so what he and his students did over the decades was shine a bright light on the positive, as I hinted, no manifest destiny, no rum, no guns to the Indians, all that stuff. But in the process, what he did was reduce the Native American populations to a joke, a cipher. If you look at the Borderlands, the early Borderlands studies, which Bolton and his student Bannon, who was a Jesuit, there are actual chapters entitled Borderland Irritants. That's how they talked about the Indians. And so there's been a huge reaction in the anthropological community against that. Good points for Borderland studies for pointing out the important differences between a British and a Hispanic background and strategy and objectives, and the changes in lives and people's real lives in those two areas. But the view of Native Americans as basically subhuman and children, and there are lots of quotes that I could pull out about Borderlands, has given really a new reason to look at Borderlands. Now we can do it, that map I started with, and what I said today. The Indians' populations are so different across the Borderlands. Where's the study of that? Where's the analysis of that? And that's what we've been working on for quite a while. So there, we feel, and as we look around, there are any number of archaeological and anthropological Borderlands studies that are focused on the Borderlands and making contributions. Now your real question goes back to, you probably know the name David Weber. Well, David, he was a professor and he created the Borderlands Studies Center at Southern Methodist University. Well, David wrote the classic 1992 book at Yale on Borderlands history. And when he was working on that, he and I ended up being discussants in a historical archaeology session on mission archaeology. And we sat through a bunch of boring papers. And David and we hadn't met yet. And he got up and he said, all of this talk, this is mostly California, there is not one thing that I heard in any of these papers that is of the remotest relevance to Borderlands historians. And that's a pretty bold statement. So I was next, and I couldn't do anything except take the challenge and said, I can't think of any one topic that we heard in those papers that would not revolutionize the history of the Borderlands if you'd get out of your own field and read some other literature. So David and I went out to lunch after that. He was at Stanford then, at the think tank, working on his California chapter. And we started a dialogue about that. And he was pointing out the phony reconstructions of the California missions, and there were really some awful ones. And I said, but you have to have archaeologists to tell you that that's phony history. And we started this thing. And it went on, well, until David died a few years ago. But I went down, he had me at the Borderlands Institute to talk about exactly that. But I didn't ever, I'm too much of a gentleman to make him admit it. But every one of his cohorts that he admitted into the Borderlands history group has an archaeologist in it. Every one. To his credit.